Croeso I Gŵyl Haf. Today we are looking at a book by Gabriela Camera Caberon, The Adventures of China Iron. A quick disclaimer, Fiona and Iona throughout this talk are going to refer to China as China, which is the more accurate pronunciation, but they both wanted to sort of, I say China because obviously it's how it reads in English, and sort of they both wanted to say, you know, everyone else is calling it China. That's not a commentary on that, but like they will be calling it China Iron. So, spoiler there, I have with me today the two co-translators of this book, Fiona MacKintosh and Iona MacIntyre. Did have to do a quick double check there to make sure I got Macintosh and McIntyre the right way around.
You've done well.
Thank you. Fiona and Iona have worked together on this book and also worked together in the department of the University of Edinburgh, where they are both senior lecturers and even co-teach a module together, which we'll sort of mention a little bit later on. So thank you both for coming here.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Kaylin.
Not at all. This book was a delight when I read it. I mean, it's a delight enough in the blurb, you know, it's a very compelling blurb, may I say. And then already the book was fantastic. So I wondered if you could start with explaining a little bit about what the book is about the name itself, and sort of what China refers to, what iron refers to, and how this is based on or it's a subversion of a text called Martín Fierro by Jose Hernandez, and where that's sort of how it subverts that text. Either or. Fiona, maybe you want to start, and then Iona.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll start kind of from the beginning with the Martín Fierro, which is the text on which this draws very heavily for its characters and its plot. So Martín Fierro, or The Gaucho Martín Fierro, is an epic poem written in 1872 by Jose Hernandez, and this tells the story of this gaucho called Martín Fierro. Gaucho being a kind of Argentinian outlaw figure who lives on the plains, on the pampas of Argentina, and basically the epic poem charts his journey, and here, including going into Indian territory and being captured, and also going outside the law. So and the epic poem is told in metrical poetry, in rhymed metrical stanzas, and it's a kind of founding text for Argentinian national identity, this idea of the gaucho figure, but he's a very masculine ideal. And so Gabriela Camera's book takes this man and his story from the epic poem and gives it quite a twist in terms of gender. And I'll let Iona talk about that bit of it.
Yeah, Martín Fierro is a super masculine story about the kind of exploits, but mainly mishaps, to be honest, of the hero Martín Fierro. And in the work, there's a very sort of throwaway line to La China. So La China is not a character, just a wee reference once to his woman, who he had to leave behind when he was conscripted into the army and sent away to fight at the frontier. So just once, and bearing in mind this is an epic poem in two parts. Just this wee remark about La China. And what Gabriela Camera has done in the retelling is she's gone and she's created an actual character, and she's retold Martín Fierro, and the protagonist and the narrator is China. So I guess that's the main bit of the backstory. We're told that China is a word that's derived from Quechua, and it's just a generic blanket word for woman. That's all it is. So this novel does quite a lot in terms of actually creating a whole story and protagonism for La China. So Gabby's operating in a kind of wider tradition as well, which is the gauchesque, which is a body of work from Argentina, sometimes Uruguay, about gauchos and working on the land and living off the land and cattle raising and traveling and kind of living on your wits and kind of pitted against circumstance and nature. Anyway, that is the kind of the baggage, and the baggage would be completely digestible and understood by Argentinians on the whole. Either they might have studied Martín Fierro as a kind of set texty kind of thing at school or at uni, or just sort of absorbed the idea of the character and the narrative through kind of wider national culture. So that's fine for them, that's fine for Gabriela. But for us as the translators, naturally, we had to do something there, because our sort of notional reader couldn't be expected to deal with that and cope with all that. And we somehow had to sort of present that and provide the sort of necessary support to be able to enjoy this novel, which in itself is just a brilliant adventure story and doesn't need any kind of apparatus. And we certainly didn't want readers to feel that they needed to kind of go out and buy some sort of study guide or like Cliff Notes or anything like that. So that was what we hoped to do, that we could create this same adventure story without kind of being worthy and educational and providing a kind of synopsis of the national literature of Argentina.
Translator's note at the end kind of allows us to have a sort of halfway house on that one, because for those who want to follow up those things a bit more, they can do in the translator's note, but that's at the end, and so you do read the novel on its own terms before you get to that.
It's all different now as well. I guess we've also learned a bit about how readers operate at the moment, and so people do actually quite comfortably look up Martín Fierro on their phone, kind of very quickly.
Definitely.
It's not really actually a huge laborious research project just to do that. So that's been really interesting as well.
This is so interesting. I didn't realize this at all. So is there any added gloss? So gloss is sort of what translators might say, where you have to explain something in a translation that wasn't in an original, or you might have to sort of like something that's implied, explain it a little bit. Was there added gloss in this book? Because if there was, I certainly didn't pick up on anything being jarring. Or did you just sort of slightly, say, well, they won't have this context, but that's okay?
I think certainly in our early drafts we did, and then we kind of pared it back. We were constantly asking one another, how much do we need to explain this without wanting to actually enter into explanation? How much do we want to kind of help the reader? And I think what we put in initially was gradually reduced. So there may be a few hints. I think we maybe added in the word president somewhere, did we, Iona? Mm-hmm. Help me here.
That's a really good example. That's a good concrete example. And maybe I think perhaps there's still a little bit of gloss around family relationships, or where people are, or where people have gone, what happened, but minimal in the end, thankfully.
I think that shows a sign of a good editing process there. I always think that like books seem to come together in the editing in a way that sort of writing then seems actually less of a big deal than it's sort of portrayed to be. The structure of this book is wonderful. And it's sort of in a very clear 3 parts that sort of goes from her travels with Liz, her developing into, she stays at the fort, and she's developing into a more complex, she's able to develop into a more complex person, and then sort of finding home in the 3rd part. And because Chyna is as such a her whole early life has just been full of abuse, and so she's never been able to sort of have her own life, and sort of as she develops throughout the book, there's a linguistic journey because she is the narrator, and you sort of mentioned this in the translator's note, and I wondered if you could go into a little bit more depth about how that was for Gabriela to write and then for you to translate. Iona, then Fiona this time. Mix it up.
Yeah, China feels a kind of a burning need for a kind of escape from her very, very, very deprived and kind of dismal original circumstances, and so that comes from her. There is something kind of in her that there's a drive to do that, and she sets off on this journey with Liz and makes a really kind of bold move. And then I guess there's two main processes which start to happen, which is that Liz starts providing China with an education of all kinds of things, including linguistic, and teaches her to speak English, and gives her a name and shows her all kinds of things. And Liz has got a brilliant kind of pragmatic problem solving kind of character. So there's just a sort of decisiveness and bravery about Liz as well, which rubs off on China. And at the same time, they're traveling through the landscape of Argentina and sort of very kind of dramatic terrain. And so China is observing and learning all the time. And it's a really intense process of kind of actualization, I guess. And then they arrive at part two. Maybe I should hand over to Fiona for part two.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I mean, the whole linguistic education thing was fun for the translation process, because of course there's this bit when they're kind of talking to one another. Obviously Liz doesn't properly speak Spanish at this point, and China doesn't know English, so they're kind of like, they point to the light and they say that this is a good sign. So Liz says it's a good sign, and China says it's a buen augurio, and then they start playing around with those words and saying buen signorio and good augurio and all that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of kind of focus in the original text on this mixing and coming together of two languages. And of course, as translators, you have to think what you're going to do with that. And there's also a lot of emphasis on learning the word for tea and how that relates to the British Empire and things, which is, again, you know, it's a kind of education in what the British Empire stands for as well, because Liz is quite a symbol of empire. And then in the fort, you get this character, the Colonel, who China is kind of slightly in awe of him, because he obviously wields power. He's this patriarchal figure and everything. And she realizes how much power he has and how he wields it over other people, and that he's very successful in doing that. But obviously she resents the way in which he does it. So that's a kind of education for her as well. And we also, we as readers are educated about the kind of dark side of progress in Argentina at that point, because there's such maltreatment of the gauchos who are being forced to work there, you know, with this sort of horrible punishment of people being staked out and things. So, and then finally, when you get into the third part and you're in indigenous territory, and the characters are surrounded by this different world and the vocabulary that goes with this different world. Again, they're learning new vocabulary, and we as translators have to decide how we're going to present that new vocabulary, which to the average Spanish-speaking reader would also be quite unfamiliar. You know, not that many readers of the original text will know a huge amount of Guarani, for instance. So we actually went along the line of deciding to present that foreignness in our version as well, whilst thinking all the time about, if we insert this word in this sentence here, can you understand that it's a fruit or a vegetable or a color of a shade of green, for example. There's a lot of discussion of shades of green within nature and the landscape, you know, so, and it was nice to try and preserve some of the words that are presented in the original to give that sense of being enclosed in a new, or enveloped by this new linguistic experience.
I think there's a bit more maybe glossing in part 3 because of the Guarani, but thankfully it sort of didn't feel too artificial. It seemed like we could do it, and I think that's just luck, just some sort of symmetry between some kind of line up between English and the Spanish and the Guarani all at once that allowed that. So that was really nice. I was flicking through the pages at the end, and I saw this word tatatina, which is a word for a kind of mist, because part 3 is set in the wetlands. It's off the pampa now, and everything is all kind of moisture and water and plants growing, and I mean, just some of the words in and of themselves are so lovely. So that was great. Yeah.
Does the structure and sort of the mirror the Martín Fierro poem at all, or not really?
Not really, in that was in 2 parts. There was the original, and then was it 10 years later, Iona?
Quite so much.
Okay, maybe some. I should have checked that out beforehand. But anyway, there's the part 2, the return of Martín Fierro, which actually becomes more didactic towards the end about, you know, Martín Fierro kind of seeing the error of some of his ways and so on. Whereas this, obviously, the 3-part structure is different in that sense. But I suppose there is similarly the notion of an encounter and going into Indian territory, which is common to both, you know, but the way they experience that and the outcome of it is very different in the 2.
Yeah, the ending in this I just adore. I think that it hits the perfect balance of being hopeful, but as a reader you know that you actually aren't hopeful in the long run, because you know how this ends with them sort of retreating into Indian territory. You know that they can't stay there for forever, or that they aren't allowed to stay there for forever. And the ending also sort of, I don't know, I feel like it must rewrite Martín Fierro a little bit, because he actually gets forgiven in this way that, you know, I thought was philosophically very interesting, because you wouldn't expect, because Fierro has treated China really wrong, you know, terribly, and then she comes to meet him again. Sort of, it's his reappearance in the book, where he's forgiven, and it's sort of framed a really good way, because it's China almost, it's part of her growth that he's no longer important to her. He's no longer, you know, and she has this other life that sort of encompasses a lot of other values like polyamory and sort of work-life balance, which feels like a very sort of English way to phrase what actually is in that book, but not at all.
Caitlin, I absolutely love the fact that there was some sort of shift work pattern in Utopia. I was like, love it. It's very clear messaging. That's what we need in Utopia. Yeah.
And a lot of magic mushrooms as well that come into that section. I must admit, Iona and I had some hilarious discussions about that bit, and I should reveal that Iona has actually a mushroom dress which was worn at the launch of this book. So
I'm sorry, Caitlin, I'm not wearing my mushroom dress today, but other occasions I will definitely put it on again. Yeah.
I'll have to hold you to that. Throughout the book, obviously, there is also this element of poetry, and I know that Fiona, poetry was more your cup of tea, and it's sort of your academic background. And I was wondering, there are a few extracts here that you've chosen to retranslate rather than use the translation that already existed. I wonder if you want to talk about why you did that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the existing translation I think is great. Well, there are several existing translations, but the sort of better known one is done by a Glaswegian translator in the early part of the 20th century, Walter Owen. But since the book, Gabby's book, is a very curious mixture of this sort of 19th century setting and feel, but really quite contemporary voices in the dialogue often. So there's this kind of pervading anachronism about the whole thing, you know, that somehow it's 19th century and it's very 21st at the same time. So I think we thought that retranslating would be a better option than somehow Walter Owen's kind of quite 1920s voice going into this. But he's very good at capturing the sort of racy folk ballad feeling. But yeah, that was the main reason for deciding to retranslate. And I suppose I should say a bit about why I'm so obsessed about poetry translation. I mean, it sort of started off when I was asked, while I was in Buenos Aires for my PhD research, I was asked by an Argentinian poet who I met there to evaluate some translations that someone had done of his poetry into English. And I read these and I thought, yeah, and I was looking at them alongside the original, and I was sort of forced to evaluate why I thought they weren't quite right. And that set me thinking about what are your priorities in translating poetry? And obviously it makes a big difference if it's metrical and rhymed than if it's free verse and so on. But you know, that idea of being put on the spot and made to evaluate a translation and think what was good about it and what wasn't, kind of set me thinking about all this. And in my academic work, I've done quite a lot of looking at translation in both directions. You know, I wrote about Walter Owen's translation of another epic poem, the Uruguayan epic poem Tabaré. But I've also looked at the Uruguayan poet Circe Maya's translations of Scottish poetry into Spanish, you know, and it's very interesting comparing the sort of gains and losses in both directions. And at the moment, it's probably since about 2014, actually, I've had a weekly poetry reading group, Poema de la Semana, with a group of masters and PhD students and colleagues, where we read a poem in Spanish every week and talk about it in Spanish. And various of the people involved with this group are also translators of poetry. So issues of translation come up quite a lot in this group. And also Iona and I have taught translation together over quite a few years, and students always like at the end of an exercise to have a fair copy of the translation that we've set them. So we have often had to discuss a translation, you know, various different kinds of texts from journalistic to literary, whatever, and decide how free or how faithful, in inverted commas, we think the fair copy should be for any given kind of text. So all of those things, I think, have fed into this translation of particularly of the poetry, but of the rest of the text as well.
If you had to sum up what it is about poetry for you that has that particular interest, how would you describe it?
I think it is the feeling of freedom, because everyone knows going into it, particularly with metrical translation, that you cannot simply translate what is there in the same order. I mean, taking into account the difference in syntax and grammar of the two languages, you can't just translate what's there in the order that it's there. And you have to kind of zoom out and think, okay, in this stanza, what have we got? What are the main ideas or emotions being presented, and what's the feel of it? And so it's that kind of freedom to rework it. Yeah, it feels a bit like doing an anagram, you know. the elements should all still be there somehow. You know, but quite often in a different order, so that you still get some rhythm, some punchy endings, if that's what I mean. Here in Gabby's poem, where she imitates the style of the original Martín Fierro, there's a lot of kind of hard endings to the lines, and if you want to respect that, you have to kind of shift the word order around in English. So it's just really, really fun and very challenging. And you can be stuck for days on one verse, you know.
It's like having it mulling over there, like waiting for the right answer.
Yeah, quite often comes to you in the middle of the night. I had a dialogue with Raquel Rivas Rojas, a Venezuelan writer who translates poetry from English into Spanish recently, and she sent me a really short poem. I think it was, and the first couple of lines were like bruja, bruja, punto y aguja, which means witch, stitch and needle, and that was just like, oh yeah, obviously that has to be witch, needle and stitch, you know, but things like that just pop into your head in the middle of the night, you know. I think all translators are a bit obsessive in that way.
Fiona, I've thought of a new challenge for you. It came into my head that there are these 19th century poems called acronymos, which are metrical rhyming and also acronyms that have to spell out something down the side.
Oh.
So I'm going to send one to you. That can be your summer project.
Thank you. Oh, great.
So
I look forward to it.
You're also the perfect match for this book. Really, I can't think of a book that could have combined the two of your interests any better, because you actually studied, like, your PhD was in sort of 1800s women in Argentina, and I wondered, like, what that brought to your translation, and like what sort of that extra background allowed you to do.
Yeah, it's lovely to be asked this question. No one's ever brought this up with me at all, and I haven't kind of brought up with myself either. So I think it's just nice to see the way things are kind of stitched together over time. So yeah, I did my PhD as part of a kind of group project, and it was, the overall project was called Gendering Latin American Independence, and it was the brainchild of a professor called Catherine Davis, who's a really big figure in women's writing in Hispanic studies, and recently she's been the director of the Institute for Modern Languages Research. And I was really lucky in my PhD experience in that I worked with her in a really supportive, encouraging environment, and a feminist environment. And there was a bigger team, and people were doing different things, either from history or from literary studies. So there's an interdisciplinary kind of vibe. And I could mention Claire Brewster, who's a historian, Maria Thomas here, who's a historian. So there was something about the kind of overall scenario that I did my PhD in that's, I think, really kind of been really important in the directions I've taken and the things that I care about in research. And what you're kind of mentioning is my PhD project. So that was done under the kind of umbrella of Gendering Latin American Independence. And independence there means the creation of the republics rather than the Spanish Empire. So a big part of the overall project was looking for hidden histories of women, because it's just a very male biased part of history about kind of military male heroes, and anyone kind of else just doesn't make it into the history. So that's the kind of what we were kind of trying to address in the overall project. But my bit of the project was just about Argentina, and mainly about Buenos Aires. And I was trying to sort of understand what was being published either by women or about women, what kind of discourses about women existed at the time. So things like roles of women, responsibilities of women, problems with women, and that's a really big part of it. And when I look back on it now, I think it's so funny, because I don't think I quite understood at the time that so much of my PhD was just what were the beliefs of white male patriarchs, what did they say? So as much as it was feminist research, publishing was so dominated by male elites at the time that it was really, really hard to get kind of woman's perspective on anything. So I worked on one woman writer from the early part of the 19th century who was a war widow, and who set herself up in publishing and made a really big kind of splash on the one hand, and had a readership on the one hand, and was also just mocked and derided by being a woman with the audacity to kind of be in the public sphere at all. So since then I've approached the whole 19th century with this real curiosity to see where women are in any sense, whether in writing or in history or in any kind of discourse, any trace, any historical register. And some of that process is just deeply disappointing, because you just see very, very extreme situations, like the women of Buenos Aires who donated their jewels to the war cause. They're called patrician women. I mean, even like their name, like patrician women, just kind of says it all. And then the exclusions on the kind of basis of race as well are really, really strong. So all these kind of absences and exclusions really interested me. And that kind of means that you flash forward 20 years and you're sitting there with Fiona and Karolina Orloff, who's the director of Charco Press, and you hear about this retelling of a 19th century foundational text, and you hear that it's by a woman writer and it's feminist and it's queer, like that just lights up your world, really. You know, it's like it's a really kind of big thing. So a lot of the kind of things that I care about are in Gabriela's novel, and it's hard to say in a concrete way how that might have impacted my contribution to the co-translation. I don't know, it's really hard to sort of quantify that, but I know it's there, definitely. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say then that sort of it is only through a fictional account of fictionalizing sort of people, women now saying what would that have been like, that we can in some ways access some of those stories?
Yeah, to a big extent. I mean, there are brilliant historians now, and there are historians now with really amazing methodologies who are doing queer history of the era of independence as well, pre-colonial times, colonial times, settler. I mean, there's brilliant methodologies now, but it's true, like imagination does have to be brought to bear to be able to sort of see all this kind of in your head and hear the voices and imagine the circumstances does require imagination, because there's so little in the physical official record. So yeah, we need literature.
And also just to change the way we read the canonical texts that have been in the canon for so long, like Martín Fierro. I mean, I read Martín Fierro very differently, having translated China Iron. You know, it does make, I mean, it's that T.S. Eliot thing about, you know, sort of all the other works in the canon have to shuffle along and make space when something like this comes along, because it changes the whole nature of what's already there. And that's one of the really exciting things. I mean, we've put this, you mentioned earlier, Caitlin, that we do a course together. It's called Latin America, History and Culture Entwined. And there are only 2 novels on the course, one of which is Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and the other one is China Iron. And so we kind of enjoy the friction and the tension, you know, between these 2 sort of epic tales of Latin American history, you know. So it's good to put them into dialogue with each other. And
it's kind of, I think, I don't want to speak for her, but I think it sort of speaks a little bit to why Karolina Orloff set up Charco with Sam McDowell, because something about the way that people out of Latin America think about Latin American fiction is something that kind of got like preserved in Aspic in the 1980s, and like really stuck what the kind of like things that people want from Latin American literature when they approach it from outside. And Karolina wanted to kind of shake that up and bring contemporary writers and new experimental writers and up to the minute things and things that exist and are read now there, but hadn't somehow kind of made it through, you know, the pipes. And yeah, I also look at Martín Fierro very differently now, and with so much more affection, actually, and so much more sympathy. Yeah.
Why sympathy?
I've heard Gabriela talking about part 2, because I think someone had posed the question to her, kind of, why is this a classic? Martín Fierro is ridiculous and he's just like blundering. How does he get to be a hero? And I heard Gabriela kind of responding to this question, and she said some of it's got to do with the fact that by part 2, the Argentinian state has got him to submit and to flip and do what he's told, and that's actually the message that was being kind of transmitted when people were being taught the book at school and the book was being made into a film adaptation. Part of it was kind of, come on now, settle down, do what you're told by the nation state. So having kind of absorbed that, and then also seeing queer Martín Fierro and the tragedy of his relationship with Cruz and things like that are from China Iron. They're not in the original. That's now interfered. I can't. That can't be.
It's head
moved. Sorry.
It's headcanon. It's now both texts exist and they're both right. Yeah.
Yeah, mind you, Gabby said that she thought it didn't take much to extrapolate that relationship from the original. You just need to kind of read attentively between the lines of what's there. She's, you know, there's this very strong homosocial bonding between Martín Fierro and Cruz, and she said she just kind of ran with that. So the seeds of it are there potentially, and this is maybe like what you were saying, Iona, about the methodologies now in reading that period. You know, maybe there's a lot more queer history to be rediscovered from, you know, foundational texts if they're read in the right way by people like Gabby.
That's fantastic, because there are all these people honing those very skills sort of, you know, within online fandoms, within sort of like fan fiction in particular. Like, this is what fan fiction also does, you know. In some ways I actually quite like the idea of thinking about this book, I don't know if you agree, as like a fan fiction. You know, it's taken the original text, read between the lines, and decided I'm going to read this from a queer point of view, from a feminist point of view, and take it there.
Yeah, when I was doing my undergrad, I remember we got kind of taught this sort of concept. It wasn't exactly a technique of reading against the grain, and they implied that you could do these things, you could look for these things, but it's very difficult. And yeah, and now that I can see like a younger generation who can just spot things and see things and make connections, and it's really it's fun, and it's exciting, and a lot of it is in different places, isn't it? I also really kind of nerdishly enjoy reading what's that thing, Fiona, where people write their book reviews?
Goodreads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love hearing the responses to the Adventures of Tina on Goodreads, and someone kind of said, oh, the Colonel Hernandez bloviates, and I was like, oh, I wish I'd used the word bloviates somewhere once, sometime. It's brilliant. It's the perfect verb for him. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, that's a gorgeous word. So you both co-teach and co-translate, and something I really love about what Charco does is co-translations. I was wondering how you two met, and sort of how you just, you know, found that you liked working together.
Well, I was teaching at Edinburgh University when Iona arrived, and obviously our research interests are very close. We both focus particularly on Argentina, and we're both very interested in women's writing and so on. So it was a kind of natural pairing, if you like, and within our discipline, people who focus on Latin American literature and culture in general tend to kind of want to discuss and have research interests in common and so on. It just happens like that. So but with this particular project, like Iona said, in discussion with Carolina, we had this book club, just the three of us, to read 21st century Latin American literature, and you know, this one was just made for that combination somehow. We just couldn't believe what a great fit it was, you know. So it's that kind of circumstances brought us together, but the co-translation process was very much helped by the fact that we already know how one another works in terms of teaching, in terms of research, in terms of you know, thinking about translation.
Yeah, we had when we co-teach translation and the kind of history of that does I mean, teaching does just provoke all these conversations. It was almost like a sort of warm-up to sort of actually co-translating together, and when you're teaching something like translation, you do really get a sense of the scope and potential and the kind of level of possibility with literary translation. Just like, you can go crazy. You probably shouldn't, but like you could if you wanted to, and you were given permission to. And there's this horrible expression in English, isn't there? There's more than one way to skin a cat. And with translation and different student translations coming in, you just see there's all these possibilities and all these voices and angles and emphases, and that's always just been really exciting. And so kind of to sort of be on to be doing that together, and then to like do the practice together has been really, really good. Yeah.
When you teach translation, are there sort of some core messages that you could maybe convey to me and to the audience, as if we were, you know, maybe thinking about studying your course in the future?
Well, it's difficult to say because different texts and different discourses demand different strategies, really, you know, and we try usually to get quite a broad range. We're not just teaching literary translation, so, you know, there'll be kind of journalistic pieces in there, more historical type pieces or philosophical essays, you know, kind of different ways of writing. And so the parameters and the boundaries of what are possible within those are quite different, I think. And we do always throw in some poetry as well, because not because we like to be mean, but because we like to give students a creative outlet. That's what I call it anyway, when they say, why are we translating poetry? So yeah, I think it's one of my things that I would like to get across is be sensitive to the kind of strategies and the register, and, you know, what kind of discourse you're dealing with in the original, and know that vocabulary in that discourse very well before you start translating it. And translators do always end up specializing in particular areas. I mean, if you take someone like Fiona MacKintosh, who was the editor of China, you know, he says on his website that the areas he specializes in are philosophy, in translating history of art materials or whatever, because inevitably you get to know a discipline, you get to know the specialized vocabulary and the ways in which things are used. And that was one of the reasons why China was so difficult to translate in places, because Gabby draws on all sorts of different vocabularies and lexicons, you know. Iona, maybe you could tell about the example of the wagon.
Yeah, God knows. I just want to say before I talk about that, about the wagon, what Fiona's saying now is really sort of similar in a way to the kind of point you're making about fan fiction, Caitlin, in that if you just really get into something and you really start to understand genre and convention, then that gives you a really safe place to be creative. Once you kind of really get the norms. So sometimes when I'm teaching translation, I kind of talk about the importance of parallel texts. So actually how helpful it can be if you're translating a kind of broadsheet current affairs-y article about X contemporary topic. You go and you read and you absorb the original versions of that in the kind of parallel source in your language, and you just absorb that discourse. And it's not kind of modeling necessarily, and there's certainly no copying, but there is an absorption process that you then kind of apply and play with and extrapolate from. And about the wagon, there's a bit, a descriptive, very short descriptive passage about the wagon and the adventures of China, and that I didn't know really what mode Gabriela was operating in. And I took this quite far. Like I really wanted to know if this was a kind of history of art discourse, if it was a sort of painting composition discourse, or if it was a more kind of architectural, mathematical, technical discourse. And I kind of wound myself up in knots, just went on about it. And it was really kind of sanguine and untroubled for the whole of this. But it just bugged me. It kind of got under my skin, and we did approach Gabriela with a query on that. She was like, "Oh, don't worry about it." Just,
yeah, she was really downplayed the whole thing, didn't she?
Whatever you think. And I was like, no, not what I think. Someone tell me what this is. So yeah, there are sort of bits that can really confound and torment you sometimes, even though linguistically you know all the words, you know what the verbs are, like you get it, and yet there's something that still really mystifies you.
Oh, that was... There you go, Fiona.
No, I was only going to say that's just what's exciting about the fact that as a translator you become such an intense reader, you know, you really read everything so intensely, and that's part of the joy of doing collaborative translation, because there are two of you who've read the book equally intensely, and so you can talk about it with a degree of scrutiny and depth that you don't get with someone who maybe just read the novel but they've read a whole load of other things that week. You know, that person has been equally obsessive in their focus on every detail, which is great. It's really fun to share that.
I'm so glad you said that, because this is a theme that has come up so many times, like throughout last year's festival and this year's festival. I think Helen Vasallo's was maybe the first person I heard say this, where she was like, a translator is the closest reader a text will ever have. And I think that in some ways has come to like symbolize for me like what it is about translation that sort of takes it from me reading, you know, that does take it. It is this intense study. I love that very much.
We're so lucky in the co-translation in that we get to share that intense, close relationship to the text. That's really cool.
Yeah, gorgeous. So I also wanted to touch on sort of another theme that actually has slightly come up, probably just because of the kind of books I gravitate towards throughout the festival, is sex and portrayal of sex in the book. So, you know, it is notable in that it is explicitly queer and open and communicative about sex in a way that like absolutely is not typical of literature or of discourse more generally, but within the book the sex is very unremarkable. It is very like smoothly and deftly woven in, and is, you know, just sort of quite reflective of real life. It's just part of real life and that kind of thing. And I was wondering if there were any particular challenges there, or sort of you know, you have quite a variety of sexual encounters, including this like orgy scene. It's an incredible scene. It's so well written. And yeah, I wonder if you want to talk a bit about the portrayal of sex and relationships a little bit more in the book.
Silence.
Fiona,
that's the door. It was really difficult, and we hope it's turned out okay, but we felt like there wasn't a very good equivalency kind of between. This is more cultural, really. It's cultural, and its vocabulary as well. That the initial attempts to render pretty much any of the sex in China Iron, like initial quick drafty versions, were pretty wretched, just sort of a bit nothingy, or quite sort of funny, like unintentional, like like really immature kind of schoolboy stuff. And we just needed to go through many possibilities before we arrived at constructions and words and things that we thought were going to be okay. And you know, there's words in China, and I'm very surprised that they work in English, but they do seem to, and that's really curious as well. So that it was hard. It took quite a lot of labor. Yeah.
And excuse me, that's one of the aspects where Gabby's kind of anachronism in terms of languages is interesting, because the way sex is taught about in her novel would not be so explicit in the 19th century. You know, like you said the other day, Iona, they'd be busy covering up the legs of the piano, not speaking so so frankly about sex. So that's one aspect of it. But there's also the kind of pressure brought to bear on personal relationships within this, from the symbolism of empire. I mean, Liz being this kind of symbol of empire, and in some of the scenes China talks about hardly being able to breathe when Liz is on top of her, and there's this kind of suffocating weight of empire bearing down on China when Liz is on top of her. And so there's this sort of, it's not just about their relationship, it's also about power relationships more generally. So I think we had to be sort of conscious of all that as well in the kind of language we were choosing to talk about this relationship. So it's not just about the sex, it's also about what that implies in the broader context of the book.
Yeah, in the different sections, because like you, Caitlin, you mentioned the orgy, and actually I'm not sure which orgy you mean, because in a way there's two there's two orgies and they're really different. They require a very different, because one is grotesque.
It's the grotesque one I had in mind.
Oh, the other one. I'm very sorry.
No, sorry, I should have been more clear. Yeah, absolutely.
But I hope that in Utopia we make up for what happens on the estancia, and what happens in Utopia was really lovely to write, and it's yes, okay, sex is there, but there's also all this sort of natural description and energy, and it's their summer festival, like this is your summer festival. Gŵyl Haf, that's their summer festival is really quite different from yours. So there's also the different kinds of sex, and that's definitely up there on my kind of top 3 things that challenged me in Fiona in the translation of Gina Iron. Just
Going back to the grotesque orgy scene, I think also what Iona was saying earlier about, excuse me, what Chalco Press is trying to do in bringing, updating the Anglophone readership's view of Latin American literature. I think there's a dialogue, a pretty conscious parodic kind of dialogue going on between the orgy that you would take, the grotesque orgy, and a lot of scenes in earlier dictatorship novels from Latin America. You know, the whole figure of the colonel and the way he behaves, talking about progress and stuff when he's getting increasingly drunk and ends up with his head in a plate of beef Wellington, vomiting everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of those kind of scenes in a lot of the kind of boom Latin American novels and dictatorship novels generally, where you know, usually written by male authors, where these kind of caricatured patriarchal figures behave in really repulsive ways, and I think she's dialoguing with the tradition in that as well. So we had to be slightly conscious of literary tradition as well as kind of empire and historical specificities as well. So there's an awful lot going on behind the sex scenes, I think, as well as the superficial, what do we do with this word, you know. And Spanish in general uses much more kind of sexual and sexually explicit words in a way that English is slightly more prudish with, I think.
That's interesting. I think that chimes with some other things I've heard about Spanish in it's Rabayo's book, Holiday Heart. I'm sure I was hearing a discussion about like sex and race in particular with that book, and like words that would use in Spanish and like the difficulties of translating that, because you know, some words are, I think it was to do with description, that sometimes in correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes in description in Spanish, words will be used that would be considered incredibly racist in English, and that has something to do with Spanish being like a more literal or descriptive language in some of those ways. Is that right? Is it like, am I remembering it completely wrong? Or
you do get a lot of use of words like indio and negro in Gabby's text as well, in a way that when you put them into English, literally they come across as really offensive or stereotyping. So we did have a lot of conversations about that kind of language.
So that was there as well. Oh, see, that's so interesting. What types of solutions would you come up with to keep the sort of originality of the text but not to be racist?
I'd say we had it much easier than Rabayo's translator, because Martín Fierro is a racist foundational text, and the voice of the colonel is deeply offensive, and the kind of wider societal values that Gina hears at the beginning of her life are racist. So we were conveying that. We were conveying coloniality and sexism, homophobia. We were conveying that. So even though it was really uncomfortable for us to employ slurs, and to perpetuate those and write those down, we were doing our job in conveying the meanings that are really necessary to kind of understand the changes and the processes and the education that China receives ultimately. So yeah, I think in some ways it was easier.
So sort of the colonel, why can't I say that word at the moment? He is, you know, what epitomizes him is his arbitrariness. You know, like he is this comical character because like he, you know, has no, there's no logic to his actions. He's, you know, utterly reprehensible in so many ways. And sort of I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the sort of colonial implications of the fort and what was actually happening in Argentina at the time, for people who maybe aren't familiar with the like Argentina's colonial past.
I feel under pressure to kind of summarize. So by at this point, Argentina has won its independence and it's established as a nation state, and the elites within the population who are white and who are Creole and who tend to come from Buenos Aires are just kind of consolidating every form of control that they can possibly kind of acquire across the country, and some of that is expanding the frontier into territories inhabited by different indigenous populations. So Colonel Hernandez represents that. He's also like, it's got with the intertext, he's also the person that has stolen Martín Fierro's poems as well. So he's a kind of exploiter and appropriator of things in general. So on his estancia, which is called the fort, he is instituting this system of kind of hyper discipline, and he is just sort of thrashing the gauchos into sort of subservience and unpaid work on his estancia. And that basically just reflects the settling of the land in Argentina and just subduing all the kind of rebellious populations and taking control. And it's quite a sort of Europe-facing enterprise. You see in Colonel Hernandez, he loves Great Britain. It's kind of his goals. And so I guess that's the main kind of historical kind of window. What do you think, Fiona?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another interesting twist on the rewriting thing, that he is Colonel Hernandez. The original author of the original Martín Fierro epic is José Hernandez, and she gives his name. She didn't mention José, but she says Hernandez and gives that the name of the original author to the colonel, and then Fierro complains that the colonel has stolen his poems, whereas obviously originally Hernandez is the one who writes the poems. So it's this kind of interesting twist that the author of the original poem becomes the stealer of the poem from the gaucho himself, which is, I suppose, a little bit of a comment on the whole gauchesque literature thing, which is, you know, not written by gauchos, it's written imitating the speech and ways and manners of gauchos by people who are actually usually culturally elite city dwellers, you know. So not all, but a lot of them. So yeah, that's an interesting kind of meta literary history comment as well, I think.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask, just before I ask about what you are working on next, and sort of academically or otherwise, I wanted to mention I really like the chapter titles in this book. I think that like often I'm, you know, don't notice chapter titles, you know, or find them, you know, very unenlightening or unimportant, and in this book I really loved them, and I was wondering if you like pay particular attention to them. Is it like in Gabriela's original? I think they really add something to the text here.
We followed Gabriela's technique, so they are extracted from her prose, and we really like them as well, and we hope that they would that they would carry some kind of aesthetic, which we very much felt that they had. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is another example of the intense reading of the translator. We noticed relatively early on that every single chapter title also appears as a phrase in the chapter to which it belongs, except for one. And we wondered whether this was deliberate on Gabby's part, or whether she hadn't noticed, or whether she changed the phrase in the prose and not gone back and changed the title. You know, there's all sorts of speculations like this. But yeah, I mean, I second what Iona said, that the chapter titles were really important. And sometimes there was English in the text, which then, you know, went into the title, and we had changed the English in the text slightly. We slightly rewrote some of Gabby's English because it was supposed to be by a native speaker, Liz. And so then we were forced to slightly tweak the title as well, so that it still mirrors the text as it appears in the chapter text. So there's a lot of work has gone into the titles and thinking about them. So thank you for noticing.
No, not at all. I actually realised there was English in the original text. Is it just there in the expectation that the Spanish-speaking reader would be able to read the English too?
Yeah, and sometimes she does a bit of glossing of the English in that she'll say a sentence in English, and then the next sentence kind of explains the meaning, or at least gestures towards that meaning, so that even if the person doesn't understand the English directly, they pick up on the significance of quoting English. You know, it shows you that the Colonel is very Europe facing, as Iona said, and looks to the British Empire. So the fact that he addresses Liz with using a few English phrases is significant of that. And even if you don't understand the actual content of the phrases, you can see the significance that he is keen to show he knows a bit of English.
Oh, fantastic. Is there sort of you know, there is some interest there in sort of like in the wider conversation about what gets translated and what languages things get translated into. Like, was there any conversation around the fact that you were translating into that colonial language, and that sort of, I mean, Spanish is also a colonial language, but was there sort of a dialogue between the languages at all that you sort of had to think about? Sorry, a big question.
I think that when we were translating kind of discrete elements of the text, we often, if there was a chance to use a word or a term that had a kind of colonial feeling about it, for whatever sense, we would go for it. We went for the I'm struggling to think of a kind of adjective to describe these kind of words. So colonial, maybe pompous, maybe moderately offensive, something to sort of reflect that kind of arrogance of empire. We went for it. That was a kind of decision that we took, and that we tried to kind of insert where appropriate.
So thanks. So what are you two working on? Are you working on are you going to work on another translation in the future? And also academically, what are you studying at the moment? And what can we look for you in the future?
I'm in terms of kind of academic research that isn't translation. I'm researching multilingualism in 19th century literature, and that is just so obviously off the back of China Iron that I was really interested in the use of Guarani words from Quechua, Mapudungun in China Iron, and I wanted to see a bit about the kind of history of that. So I'm doing that. Thank you, China Iron, for the idea. And I'm not translating currently, but I'm really wanting to translate a Portuguese writer called Filipa Martins. That's what I want to do, and that's what I'm kind of angling to do. Yeah.
And one other thing that we are both involved in is an upcoming project from Charco about Latin American feminisms, where Charco is putting together a selection of essays from contemporary feminist writers in different Latin American countries. And we are both going to be translating one of those essays for the collection. I'm working a lot on another contemporary Latin American, well, another contemporary Argentinian writer, Claudia Piñero. I've just done the afterword to her novel Elena Knows, which is just coming out in Charco sometime in the next month or so. But I'm also looking forward to a translation like Iona, when I've got my next research leave, which is in January next year, I'm hoping to translate a novel by contemporary Venezuelan writer Raquel Rivas Rojas, who is also a member of our poetry group. So, you know, we work together a lot talking about translation and so on. She's got a novel called Muerte en el Guaire, which already, it's another one of these intertextual references because it refers to Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile, but the Guaire is the main river in Caracas. But of course, it doesn't work. You know, en in Spanish is on and in, and in hers it's death in the Guaire because the bodies are actually in the river rather than on a boat on the Nile. So already from the title you've got this problematic, how do you get the reference to Agatha Christie if you can't say death on the Guaire but death in the Guaire? So anyway, I'm looking forward to working with Raquel on the translation of that, which is a kind of feminist crime fiction novel.
Oh, yes, please. Well, I can't wait to hopefully read both translations in the future. And thank you so much. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. It was really enlightening. And thank you both so much for taking the time out of your, you know, university jobs and busy days. So I really appreciate it. And this has been great.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. We really enjoyed it too.
Thanks for having us. Brilliant.
Not at all. Anytime. You know, next time you do anything, just give me a call.
The horns back. Yay.
For sure. So thank you. And for anyone watching, you can find the rest of our events in sort of, if you have to be watching on the YouTube, so you can just click down below and there's a link to the rest of our events. And we also have a Patreon if anyone is able to support. And yeah, thank you all very much for watching and see you all soon.